Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In the Spotlight. I'm Mike Kanishi. I'm really excited tonight because, when you talk about writing, acting, comedy, everything, this guy has done it all in his illustrious career. He spent 4 years on Hollywood Squares, did a lot of writing for them as well. I believe he was the head writer. He's worked with people such as Bette Midler, Diana Ross, the Donny and Marie show, Florence Henderson, Whoopi Goldberg, Dave Letterman, Billy Crystal. This guy is a legend, and it is my honor to introduce to you the one and only Bruce Vilanch. And Bruce, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a real honor.
Pleasure. I wish my lighting was as soft and flattering as yours.
Well, so
I
Bruce,
seem to be in I'm in the air raid light, but that's okay. What can I do?
so Bruce, let's start off right off the bat. How did you get into acting? How did you get that love for it, or writing in general?
I just always I had it. I mean, it was from the time I was a kid. My mother said I learned how to read by looking at the movie ads in the paper. Back then they had them, and I learned how to read that way. And I would still, I kind of spoke a theater before I spoke English. And I would make faces in the mirror and perform and force myself on the relatives at parties. And so my parents looked at each other and said, he may be show business bound. My father was a doctor, and so, but they enabled it. They didn't discourage it. They only wanted me to make a living. And so they when I started writing, they encouraged that because they said, well, newspapers will never die. Who knew? So they figured the opportunities were greater in writing than in performing, and they weren't completely wrong. But that's partially because I was a heavy kid. I had a deep voice, and I was not athletic. And I would play kids parts, I wasn't terribly convincing. But then I would play adult parts, and I seemed to. They would say, "My, he's awfully mature for his age." So I was doing that, but I wasn't getting hired for that kind of thing. So I started writing, and that led to everything else.
Right. So let me ask you, when you were like in high school, did you do any theater, or were you?
I did tons of that, as much as
Yeah.
they would let me. We
Right.
did, we had the Dramatic Society at East Side High School, Paterson, New Jersey, famous for Lean on Me, with Morgan Freeman playing our high school principal, Jolton Joe Clark, who had a baseball bat he walked around with.
Yeah.
So the place is well known, sort of. And so I did a million shows there. I went to a camp that was run by a guy named Ted Mack, who was the Simon Cowell of his day. He had a TV show called Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour, and if people would go on. Elvis went on, actually, and Ted Mack rejected him. He said, "You're too dirty for me." So Elvis went on to become Elvis in spite of Ted Mack. But Ted Mack ran a camp, and I went to it, and we did a lot of shows up there. So I was doing all of that all the time.
Right. And interestingly enough, Bruce, you talked about your writing career, but I believe you first started writing at the Chicago Tribune, right? That was
Uh,
one of
it
your
was
early work.
almost the first. Yeah, I did. I was at the Miami Herald and Detroit Free Press, and then I landed after college at the Chicago Tribune, where I began interviewing people, show business, features kind of stuff. And that was where I met Bette Midler, who was just starting out. She was on Broadway in Fiddler on the Roof, and on her vacation, she came and played a club in Chicago called Mr. Kelly's. That was a very well regarded nightclub. They had a lot of nightclubs in those days. It's a culture that's kind of disappeared, but now they call it cabaret, and
And
it's
you wrote some material. You wrote material for her Clams of the Half Shell, correct?
I did. I've written a ton of stuff with her. Only it's only been 50 years, but yeah, we're still doing it. Clams was in '75, and that was a big Broadway extravaganza.
And let me ask you. I'm sure you could tell. Not that any of us could say we're music experts, but I'm sure when you heard her sing, you could just tell that she was on to something because
Oh,
what a voice she had. She was tremendous throughout her career.
it was a great voice, and not just that, but it was her stage presence. She's the greatest stage performer I've ever seen. I mean, she can do anything. She can make you cry. She can make you shriek with laughter. and she's brilliant. I mean, there have been great stage performers. Judy Garland was great, and I mean, before her, Al Jolson was great. But she had that thing, and the moment I saw it, I said, "There's nothing. I've never seen anything like this." She transmits something, and that's the key to the really great ones. They don't they don't have to do that as much anymore because if they're good at one thing, they can turn that into $1 billion industry. They don't have to be, they don't have to be good
Yeah.
at too many things.
Right. So let me
They
ask
should
you,
be good
Bruce.
at everything.
Let me ask you this: did acting come along with the writing you were doing? Did you go to acting school? I mean, how did acting come about for
Well,
you?
I took acting classes in college. I never actually went to an acting school. That seems clear. I but I was always doing it. I was, a child actor, never a child star, but a child actor, and I picked up a lot along the way. And as I got more into it, I took classes, but I never actually went to a formal acting school. I think if I had made it my primary career, I would have. But my writing was my primary career, and acting became the side hustle. And then every now and again, it would emerge, like when I did Hairspray on Broadway.
Yeah.
It was, suddenly I was, for 2 years, I was 8 times a week strapped into a girdle and with huge jugs. And I was in the Turnblad.
Yeah.
That was acting.
And let me ask you, Bruce. I've always wondered about this because nowadays you're seeing more people, they're doing acting, some are doing independent, they're doing it locally and stuff like that. But to really make it big, is it important for people to be out in Hollywood? What is your opinion about that?
Um, it traditionally has been. I mean, you have to go where they're looking, and it's New York and L.A. where they're looking. New York has a huge theatrical stage culture, so there are more opportunities. And out here, of course, it's about film and television. Um, but you have to go where they're going to notice you. You can go to some place like Chicago, which had an extraordinary theater community that was supported by a lot of commercial work. People did voiceovers, people did um, industrial shows, stuff like that, and that kept them working. That kept them, living. But they weren't seen nationally, and so. But it was a great lab. It was a great place to work out stuff. I mean, back then, Second City was only in Chicago, and a lot of people emerged from it, but they had to go elsewhere. Nobody emerged from Chicago. Oprah emerged from Chicago. Hugh Hefner emerged from Chicago, and some music people did, but even they uh, had to be seen by the music business in New York and LA. So it is like that now. It's much easier for them to see you now than it was in the old days. You can go on TikTok. I mean, you can build the whole thing. I mean, a lot of people have gotten rich doing that. I don't know that a lot of actors have started their careers that way. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but it certainly is a way to get noticed. I mean, there's how you sustain it is another issue, and in fact, many times it doesn't sustain because after you've made $1 billion in TikTok, what do you need TikTok for? You've got $1 billion. Go be Elon Musk.
Yeah. One of the things, Bruce, that I always find fascinating about writers is just it's one thing to perform comedy or to do stand-up comedy. It's another thing to write it and to write good comedy. And I think you wrote a couple of episodes for The Simpsons. I could be wrong, but I do recall that. And
I was on The Simpsons. I didn't write for
yeah,
The Simpsons.
okay, so you were on it,
I was one of a guest for a
but
one-line guest.
I
This
can
is season
remember.
11. So I'm
Yeah,
amazed, but now they're like on season 37.
yeah,
I'm
and the thing
amazed that
about
people remember it.
but the thing about that show, I can remember especially the first 11 seasons where, I mean, some of the lines they would have in that show, they were just hysterical. And that's just one of so many shows and movies like that. Just these guys are so talented at writing. I
Oh, they're
mean,
brilliant.
what do you think it takes to be a good writer? Because I mean, you can't just be funny. You have to be very have a great imagination and be very innovative.
Well, you pretty much answered it. I mean, on The Simpsons, they do have to be funny. They have to have a funny way of looking at things, and also um, they have to be up on what's happening in the world and be aware of what has become sort of homogenized in the world that the audience will get. And part of the reason of the sharpness of the show is that they capture those things as they're happening. If you are still one of the people who has cable TV, um, you could get a channel called FXX,
Hmm.
which is almost wall to wall Simpsons.
Yeah.
And God knows they have 37 years of shows that they can put on there. So, and that's where that my show keeps turning up. But when you look at it and you realize there are certain jokes that you say that was so hot at the moment when they did it. A joke about I can't think of anything that comes to mind, but some amazing thing. I mean, maybe about remote control. About the grandfather not using remote control, or something like that. But they're right up on what is happening, and they fold it in, and it's hilarious because the family never changes. They're not a day older
Yeah.
37 years later. That Maggie is still only saying one thing, which Elizabeth Taylor actually recorded. The one word she says, "Mama."
Yeah.
Elizabeth recorded it. That was also season 11. And I ran into her. I was leaving and she was arriving to record her one line. Back then, you had to go in and record things. You had to
Yeah.
actually go to the studio. You couldn't Zoom it. You couldn't steam yard it. You had to go into the studio and do it. So there was Elizabeth Taylor
Yeah. It
coming
really is.
up the steps at Fox.
Yeah, it really is amazing. So let me ask you, Bruce. You've done, like we mentioned, a lot of stand up, and we're going to get to that some more. But I think about when guys like yourself were really doing stand up, late '80s. I think of a guy like Sam Kinison, who was very talented. I mean, you didn't have. I mean, you had a lot of people doing stand up, but not a lot were on TV. You guys were, one of the few. Now you see everybody doing it. So I really believe that since the 21st century came out, we've seen so many stand-up comedians like nothing we ever saw before. It's really become bigger than it ever has
Well,
been.
that's thanks to cable and streaming. When I was your age, there were the three television networks, and uh, people would show up on as guests on TV shows. There were no stand-up comedy specials. I mean, people didn't do that, and partially that was because stand-ups have almost always been ahead of the curve, and they defied censorship, and the censorship was so heavy that when the Smothers Brothers began to do stuff that was considered risque or political, it was a shock because nobody had done that. Stand-ups did, stuff about home and family and the phone company and all that. So that whole world has changed. Cable came in and enabled them to do their shows the way they did them on stage,
Right.
and uh, what we now call the legacy networks have had to catch up. And SNL had a lot to do with that. SNL was one place where they could cross the line, but it was Saturday night at 11:30, 10:30 Central. So they could get away with stuff. And that kind of killed it on prime time because you couldn't compete. You couldn't be as hip as the guys on SNL because the censors would not let you. So cable and SNL conspired to do that, and now as a result, now they're like they're also. It has to be pointed out that a stand-up special is very cheap to produce.
Yeah.
You know, you wrangle Leslie Jones into a theater for a couple of nights. Her audience comes; they adore her, and you light the place up so it looks like better than the dump it is. And she's out there with a stool and a bottle of water, and wearing Converse sneakers in one outfit, and she does an hour. It doesn't cost much at all compared to what it would cost to put
Yeah.
on, Wicked, one night of Wicked. So there you go. It's a cost effective way, and it attracts a big audience. And by the way, I love Leslie Jones. I think she's one of the truly. She's just a funny person. I mean, she doesn't have to do much to make me laugh. She's just her attitude is hilarious.
Now, let me ask you, Bruce, do you think that, like, when you're doing stand up comedy and you're doing anything that's comedy, do you think that has to be some of your personality outside of the job? I mean, you have to be funny, you have to kind of be yourself in order to make it
I
work.
I think the stand-ups, by and large, are people who, if they weren't doing this on TV, they would be doing it at the Thanksgiving dinner table.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a point of view, and this is how they express it. And uh, some are not like that, you know. Some, I mean, Bob Newhart is exactly as Bob Newhart was on his TV series,
Mhm.
and his stand-up act before. He's a funny, sort of regressive kind of guy. And then, you know, there are animal comics like Robin and Sam Kinison who prowl the stage and have an attitude. They're funny, they're angry, that's their performance thing. Um, Ideally, you have a performance persona, and then you have who you really are beside that. A lot of them have trouble as they get more famous uh, reconciling the two because you know because people when they see people they want to see the person who they know from TV, and that may not necessarily be how that person is feeling that day. Yeah, but it's the kind of thing where it's like the famous Marilyn Monroe story where she's was walking through the park with a babushka, a kerchief, and sunglasses, and she was kind of dressed down. And she said to her friend, "Hey, it must be terrible living with this fame." And her friend said, and she said, "You want to see Marilyn?" And her friend said yes. And so off came the scarf, off came the glasses, and suddenly she was Marilyn Monroe. And suddenly people began gravitating towards her in Central Park
Yeah.
because she had become Marilyn Monroe. A minute before, she was another girl walking through the park with her friends, not doing any shtick, out of her performance mode. And very instructive. I mean, I tell that story to people who are getting, as they're coming up the ladder, and they're beginning to go, oh my God, I was at McDonald's and I had to do 5 minutes.
And I'm sure, Bruce, you've been doing it so long that the nerves aren't there anymore. But in the beginning, when you were doing this, I mean, were you ever like frightened to go out there? Because I mean, it takes a lot of courage to do
Yeah,
stand up. It's not easy.
I, I was I was always frightened. I mean, you never know what you're going to get, and so I prefer to think of it as you're going into the alpha state, which is you're phasing everything else out around you because you're focusing on what you're going to do on stage. That seems to me to be the cure for it. But I understand. Uh, with me, my career is unusual because I was never trying to be that. It was something I was doing for fun. I, uh, and so there never felt like there was that much at stake because there really wasn't. If it didn't work out, I would go back to writing or I would find some other way of presenting myself. But for people who this is what they do, it's actively terrifying, and I can understand how it seizes you up and you can't function. It's yeah, it is. It's very scary. I've also made it a point when I perform not to go any place where I don't think they know who I am, and they don't know what to expect,
Yeah.
because you know that's the curse of comic number 14 at the Laugh Factory every night. He's walking out to an audience that probably came because they heard Kevin Hart was going to be on the bill, and you're a comic. They have no idea who you are, and so you really have to work to get them on your side, depending on the mood that they're in. And I don't want to ever have to do that. I mean, they've come to see me. If they don't like what I'm doing, that's something else. But they know what they're in for.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to come out there and they go, "Oh my God, he's gay," or "Oh shit, he's a Jew," or whatever it is. All of my many minorities, of which I am a member. He can, and I don't want that to happen. I've had that happen. That bitter experience has taught me I don't need that.
Yeah. And Bruce, I think it was 1974 or 1975. You did a movie with Diana Ross. I think it was Mahogany, and that really, I look at that as right place at the right time because that struck up a great friendship between you two. And you actually wrote a lot of material for her stage
I
act
did.
as well.
I did. Well, I was in Chicago. Those were my Chicago days. I was at the trip, but I did like commercials and stuff around town. And they were shooting Mahogany in Chicago at the beginning before they got to Rome. And there was a casting person who used me, and I commissioned her, and they had this one thing, and she put me up for it. And the director I'd met the director by happenstance in a restaurant, and so he said, I know that guy. Let's cast him." So I got cast. The director was promptly fired, and a new director came in, and he was fired. And then Berry Gordy took over and directed it, and it wound up being the first day Berry Gordy directed. So it was quite an episode. But Diane and I then got friendly, and a few years after that, when I moved out to Hollywood, and she had left Motown and was on her own, as it were, surrounded by Motown people, we put together a big Vegas act for her that wound up being a big television special, and it was during the Love Hangover period.
Yeah.
If you are old enough to remember, if there's a cure for this, I don't want it. It was her disco hit.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what a talent she is, and
Oh yeah,
was. I mean, I don't ever recall a bad Diana Ross song, and with the Supremes, she was magic by herself. She was magic. I mean, just a tremendous, tremendous
incredible.
talent. So to be
And
able to,
it's the most natural voice. She just comes out and sings.
yeah, and to be able to,
It's not like she's trained. I mean, she just sings, but and sounds the same now as she did then,
yeah, definitely does. And
and looks amazing. I mean, yeah,
now
that's
to
why
talk
she's Diana Ross.
right now, talk to me about that, Bruce, because you also wrote a song. It was called "Where Is My Man."
Oh,
That
for
was
Eartha, yeah.
so. How do you like writing music? I mean, do you enjoy writing music as
I
well?
actually write lyrics. Other people
Lyrics,
write the
yeah,
music, and that it was a happy accident because one of a great disaster I worked on was a movie called "Can't Stop the Music," the Village People story, and I wrote the first draft and quit. But I got friendly with Jacques Morali, who created the Village People, and after all of that had blown over, he had a club in Paris, and it was Crazy Horse. It was a famous club, and it had these gorgeous women, and they would come out topless, and they would sing. They would lip sync, and he would get other famous singers to do the tracks, and these girls would lip sync. And he got Eartha Kitt, who was sitting in Connecticut doing nothing, and she had had a big career, but she got into some political trouble when Johnson was in office, and she got despondent and quit everything. And we brought her back just to do a vocal. We wrote this song, "Where Is My Man?" And like a 7 foot tall blonde Amazonian who I don't know how she could stand up without pitching forward, came out topless and sang the song that anybody who was listening to the lyrics was staggering. There was so much to look at. So, nevertheless, Jacques got the song on French radio, and it exploded. And we were a number one disco song all over the world, except of course in the U.S. where they wouldn't play disco on radio. So, but they played it all over the place at clubs. And so Eartha, he brought her out from Connecticut, did a tour, and we did an album called "Where's My Man" of songs that Eartha sings. And it was great because it kind of brought her back. And then she began working again and went to Broadway and went to London and did all these things. So that was, and I love writing it, but of course I was writing it the way I write comedy material for people, very specifically for her persona. She was a sex kitten, and she would make purring sounds. She was Catwoman on Batman for a while. I mean, that's how far she took the sex kitten. She was Catwoman, and and she was a gold digger. That was her character. She was looking for a rich guy, always looking for a rich guy, and so that was fun to write because I was writing to her character. I think I haven't become a lyricist because most lyricists write about heartbreak, They write about how much I love somebody, or they write about how much I loved somebody. I mean, those are almost all songs are either one of those
Yeah.
two. And then, if they write for musicals, then they have to write other kinds of stuff beside that. But I wasn't. I mean, I made a few attempts at it, but um, since I don't compose, everybody has a different way of writing a song. I mean, some people like Rodgers and Hammerstein were famously. I think Hammerstein wrote a lyric and Rodgers would write a melody. But then Rodgers and Hart, I believe, Rodgers wrote a melody and Hart wrote a lyric. So two different ways the same composer was writing it, and he also wrote some songs for himself after they were both dead. But some people have to sit in a room and write the song with each other, and then some people send each other tapes. So it's every way is different, and I never quite figured out how to be an efficient lyricist, and with various composers. What can I say?
Right. So let me ask you, Bruce. I think I want to say it's been you've done over 20 different Academy Award specials. You've helped write the material and things like that. I know you helped Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg. Talk about doing that, because I mean, that is if that's, if the football is the Super Bowl, that's TV Super Bowl
Yeah,
every.
sure.
So talk about what that's been like doing that.
It was phenomenal for exactly that reason. You knew that if you fumbled in this one, everybody would remember it. And I did it officially 25 times, and more times, a few more times unofficially. But their emotions run high, and it's a very difficult show to put together because, as Johnny Carson said, it's an hour of entertainment stretched out over a 3 hour show. There's a lot of people you've never seen, a lot of science nerds getting awards because they made Batman sound good.
Yeah.
And they get because of the way the Academy operates, they get equal time with the biggest star in the world who wins an acting award. So it's difficult to put together, but it's a great deal of fun. And um, I have written a book which will be coming out next year, and it is about how I wrote the worst shows in television history and lived. Because I keep getting asked about the Star Wars Holiday Special and the Paul Lynde Halloween Special, the Brady Bunch Variety Hour,
Yeah.
and then in film, Can't Stop the Music. And of course, my first Oscar show that I officially wrote was the Rob Lowe Snow White show, which was, I mean, considered a benchmark disaster. So it's a book about how I did all those things and lived. It's called It Seemed Like a Bad Idea at the Time. And it will be out next year. So, and there's lots of Oscar lore in there about how the Oscar show is put together in spite of itself, because it's just amazing who says they won't do it and won't go near it, and the many things that backfire when you try to make it different. You know, when you try to bring a grizzly bear on stage to present an award, that kind of
Yeah. And I mean, that has to be, though, one of the highlights of your career, though, because I mean, like I said, that is the, big thing in TV every year. That's the yearly event that people come, you have everybody glued to watching those Oscars. I mean,
thing.
especially like when you want somebody to win and you sit through that whole thing to wait for them to get announced. So, I mean, really, that you've been able to be such a part of something that is a big piece of TV has to
Oh
be
yeah,
a great honor for you.
yeah, it is. I mean, I always wanted to win one. That probably won't happen, but I've won 2 Emmys for writing 2 of those shows, and
Yeah.
my mother was eternally confused. She would say, "He won an Oscar for writing it." I said, "No, you can't do that." I said, "I won an Emmy for writing it." Oh, that's it, an Emmy for the Oscar. That's okay. She never quite got it.
But the way I look at it, though, Bruce, you won the Emmy for writing about the Oscars doing material, but it's a TV show. Even though the Oscars are about films, it's on. I usually ABC does it, and it's on TV. So, I mean, to me, it
Well,
may not be an Oscar, but winning that Emmy is just as big as winning that Oscar, because you are making sure that those Oscars, that people are going to laugh when they're watching it.
I have the age-old prejudice of Hollywood. Movies are more important than television, which is, of course, a joke now because movies are television. But the TV Academy takes your position that it's a variety show, like any other kind of variety show, and so it should be treated as that. You can't win an Emmy for writing the Emmys, though.
Right.
That's too meta. They decided long ago that they had to disqualify that. Also, they felt that there would be too many people who felt they had to vote for it out of some sort of misplaced loyalty to the TV Academy.
And let me ask you, Bruce. I mean, I think you've won about 6 Emmys in some capacity, but what was the feeling like to win that first one? Because some people go years and they get nominated a bunch of times and they don't win. So the fact that you've won
I had
multiple,
been I had been nominated a few times and lost, and so it was very gratifying. And what was unusual was that Billy Crystal, it was for a Billy Crystal show, and the one where Jack Palance did one-arm push-ups on stage, and we kind of tore up the script and rewrote it, and so we were basically getting it for that. Billy had didn't think we would get nominated. I don't know. He was in Hawaii. He was on a family vacation that he had to go on to do. He wasn't there. As a result, all the writers got to say something by way of acceptance. Had he been there, he would have made the acceptance speech. But we all got to say it. They weren't going to cut us off because everybody who runs the Emmy show were colleagues of ours, and they were happy to let us go on. So I got to make a one-line speech. I said, I'd like to, I'm just only sorry I didn't have to sleep around to get this award. And then they went to commercial, and the director said, thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the outs. But we can go out on a laugh. I was very proud of myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous
And the
accomplishment.
following year we won again, and Billy was there, and Billy made the speech.
So let me ask you, Bruce. One of the shows that I always loved as a kid and loved it as an adult as well is Hollywood Squares. And you had a lot to do with that. You were on it, you wrote for it. And I always liked the whole secret square thing. I thought that was cool. And then the winner would, get a chance to start a car up. And it was just a great show. And it had a lot of famous people that would do it. And I always thought it was so cool. How did you like doing that show?
Well, ours was the third iteration of it. The first one was on NBC for 14 years, and Paul
Yeah.
Lynde came into it. By the time it was over, he was a center square in the Star. At the same time, he was doing Donny and Marie, which I was writing, and so I would go over with him to and write some jokes for him, and the other people wrote jokes for him. So I had some experience of the show, but then there was another version in the 80s with Joan Rivers, and
Yeah.
I wrote some stuff for that. And then they came to the people who produced Comic Relief, which I had written 12 of, I think. And they got the show, and they wanted it to be more of a comedy show, not so much of the games, more jokes. And so they asked me if I'd be the head writer. And I said, absolutely. And then Whoopi came in, and she wanted me to host it. And they said, well, we don't really think he's right for it, but they didn't want to piss her off early on. So I tested, and and this one's for the win, Louise. And that didn't take. So they put me in the square next to her. And so suddenly, for the next 4 years, I was just to the left of Whoopi, if that's possible. And
Yeah.
suddenly I was a famous person. So that was, it was, but now, aside from that, doing the show was fabulous. We shot 36 days a year. We would do a week in a day. We do 5 shows a day. So it was intense because there was a lot of material to cover, but it was like a party all day long. And nobody acted up because there were 9 people up there. And if you acted up, there were 8 people looking at you going, girl, get it together. So with a few rare exceptions, people acted up. Roseanne was in a bad mood, which is not news to anybody, I guess. Although she said she had 43 personalities, so the other 42 were probably in a better mood. Anna Nicole was chemically altered. That's no surprise to anyone either. But she was amiable, I mean, it wasn't like, nobody was pitching a fit.
Yeah.
It was difficult to work around. That's all. But generally, it was just so much fun, and especially after lunch when there was wine. And the Thursday and Friday shows were a lot looser. But the marketing people told us that the audience watching at the end of the week was looser also because it was the end of the week, and they weren't so uptight. They were putting it behind them. Isn't it fascinating? They had focus groups, and they found that out.
And that's the type of work that, I mean, I'm sure you enjoy everything you do, but that's the type of work that is got to be so much fun because you're basically just sitting there and you might get called on by the contestant and then you get
Yeah,
to answer a question. You get to be a little funny and then you get to answer it. So I mean, even though you're shooting 5 shows a day, it's still got to be something,
oh yeah, sure.
that you just never get tired of doing.
Yeah, right. Uh, yeah, you learn the tricks of it. I mean, we gave everybody a bluff. We gave people who we thought could handle a joke, and we give everybody a bluff because if they didn't know the answer, they could give it an answer that sounded like it. And we didn't really know the answers, but a lot of the questions had no real answers. It would be, according to Dr. Joyce Brothers. Well, who knows what the hell Joyce thought? I mean, who
Yeah.
read? So that was that. What that meant was we made this up, or Joyce probably they pulled something out of her column, and but unless you were an avid reader of Joyce Brothers was an advice columnist. For those of you who have zoned out on her name. But she was a game show contestant who won a lot of money when game shows were rigged, and as a result, she became a TV personality off of that. And she was like a psychologist who would come on and talk seriously about stuff. But I mean, she became so famous for being so cool that people used to try to break her up, and that was hysterical. It was always hysterical to watch the facade drop. It was really funny.
Yeah.
So we had her on the show a lot because she was a lot of fun.
Right. And you mentioned a little earlier about working on the Donny and Marie show. I mean, again, I mean, this was just TV that was so popular, Bruce, and you got to do so much of this. I mean, that's a credit to you as a writer because they're not going to ask you to come back if you're not giving them good material.
That's true, and it was kind of a minefield because they were young. Marie was not yet 18. Donnie was. She became 18 in the course of the show, but and there were devout Mormons, and there were a lot of things I learned about the Latter Day Saints. I mean, there were no coffee breaks because they don't drink caffeine, and so you couldn't put that in a script. I mean, there were a million things you could not refer to, and they had, they were the network censor would be reduced to counting the beats on a strobe light in a disco number because apparently a certain cadence sends epileptics into seizures. It triggers. So that was, she says, I'm down to counting beats in disco songs. There's nothing to take out of the script. They've taken it all out ahead of her.
Yeah.
She was very happy. She didn't have much to do, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was fun. I mean, there were other shows that were classier. I mean, they generally involved bigger, older stars, but um, that show was fun to do, and everybody was on it. I mean, anybody who wanted to connect with the youth market was on that show, no matter how old. Lucille Ball
Yeah.
showed up. I mean, they were
Are you a
everybody.
fan of variety shows like that or?
Well, I was at the time. It was what I did. I look at them now and I kind of cringe like everybody else. Every now and again, there'll be something which I say, well, now that really works. That is really interesting. I did a show for Cher called Cher and Other Fantasies. And one of her fantasies was West Side Story. And we did an 18-minute segment where she played every character in West Side Story and sang a whole bunch of the songs. And I mean, as I recall, it really showed her versatility and as a singer and just as a performer. And it was so off the wall that would happen, that she would do that. So every now and again, you come across something like that, and you say, "Well, gee, that was really interesting."
It's funny you bring her up because I look at her as, I mean, she was a phenomenon in two different careers, music and acting. Because I mean, I can
Yeah.
remember that movie Mask that she did when she played
Hmm.
Rocky Dennis's mother, and she was
Yeah.
phenomenal in that. She was just a talent all around.
Oh, yes. I mean, she's had had hits in every decade from the '60s on, and this fabulous acting career that she does or doesn't do, depending on how she feels like it. And it's God knows she's durable.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's
So
pretty amazing,
yeah, it
and
really,
hasn't changed. I mean, her attitude is the same. I mean, the thing
yeah,
about her is she's still she's still like a teenage girl. I mean, she was tweeting before anybody, because she's in bed doing tweeting, because like a teenager,
yeah.
and speaking in initials, OMG. Like,
Oh boy.
she will never let go of her teens, of her youth.
Yeah, it's probably kept her
Uh,
young though, when you think about it.
yeah, I'm sure.
So Bruce, one of uh, the things that was really popular that you did was an off-Broadway production called Bruce Vilanch, Almost Famous.
That was
So
funny.
talk about that, because that really was like something that
Well, it
really
was.
kind of
I was on Squares, and so I was on TV every night, and people knew me, and I got a lot of offers to do performance things, and so we put together this show, where I told stories about the things I had done, and some things from before that, and did a bunch of musical numbers. And it was put together by Scott Whitman, who, with Mark Shaman, wrote Hairspray, which I subsequently did on Broadway and on tour. Um, and it was, I had a great time. It was a wall of T-shirts behind me from my own collection, because I'm famous. Here's Batman meets Catwoman for real. They're not so thrilled with each other. Um, but it was 20 years ago. So I mean, I have a whole lot more stories since, but it was great fun to do, uh, because I was almost famous. It was. Yeah, I mean, I still to this day I walk through airports, and people will be taking selfies with me, and people will be walking by, and they'll say, "Who's he?" It's that kind of fame. It's not Angelina Jolie kind of fame. It's that kind of. I know I've seen him on TV. I can't remember his name, whatever. Or, oh my God, it's Bruce Vilanch. I'm in love with him. It's one or the other. So, and it always was like that. And that was the genesis of that idea. I'm
yeah.
almost.
And that's really creative, because that is I always wondered how you got the name for that, but that's really a great title, because
I
it's
did,
like,
and Cameron Crowe co-opted for his movie, and cheerfully admits that. So, and that's, and he wrote a musical of Almost Famous.
yeah.
That almost made it, but didn't. I mean, it came on, it didn't work. It didn't work on Broadway. I bet they'll be doing it a lot in regionals, because everybody knows that movie.
Right. And Bruce, it seems like every decade Bruce Valanche comes out with something new that really just captures the imagination. And I mean, I think of An Evening with Friends that you did with Florence Henderson, and I've been a Brady Bunch fan my whole life.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've always wanted to get a cast member. I've been trying for 4 years, maybe someday. But the fact that you got to work with somebody as talented as Florence, that has to be also another highlight in your career.
I'd known Florence, from Broadway, from her New York days, where I just met her around town, and then she came to Hollywood. And I saw her when I was here, and actually, when I came out to LA, it was with Manhattan Transfer, who were about to celebrate their 50th anniversary, and they're going to hang it up now. But uh, and but the show, we did a TV show in 1975, and got great reviews, and people loved it, but the ratings were not terrific. And I would go around for looking for other jobs, and they would say, "Oh, we love that show, but you're too hip for what we're doing." And I had dinner with Florence, and she said, "Come do the Brady Bunch. They'll never say you're too hip again." So at the time, they had cooked up. Fred Silverman had cooked up the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, which was on ABC. We did 9 of them over the course of a season. It was on what they called a wheel. It was us one Sunday. The following Sunday would be the Hardy Boys, and the Sunday after that would be Nancy Drew, and then we would come back on the fourth. So we were around once a month, and so it never really developed any traction because we weren't on every week. No, but they said, "Oh yeah, but you're a special. You're on." It didn't work out that way. Also, the show was kind of ridiculous. I mean, there are books about how ridiculous it was, and it's in my book, as a matter of fact. But at that point, Florence was having a great time because basically, she's a triple threat. She could act, sing, and dance.
Yeah.
So she could do these sketches, play these characters. She was brilliant, gorgeous Broadway soprano singer, and she could dance. She could a musical comedy performer, and the rest of them weren't. They either were really not, or were good enough to get away with it at state fairs, where the audience had come to the fair and they were doing a show. So, but so she got obviously stood out and was having a good time. And many years later, I started writing. She had an act, and I was writing for her act. And then somebody had the genius idea of putting us together on a bill, which we did out in the Hamptons, and we had a great time. We were going to do it more, but it just didn't work out. And then suddenly, she was died very suddenly.
Yeah.
She was fabulous. You would have loved her. I mean, she was not Carol Brady. People continue to think that she was the Brady mom. In real life, she was not. In real life, she was married to a Jewish guy in show business who ran the Schubert Theater chain. They had 4 kids. Her daughter was Elizabeth Taylor's lawyer for years. But she juggled all of these things, and she was very bawdy and very hip, and but she was old school. She was like they kept promoting her as the American Julie Andrews, and she was old school, and but she wasn't Mary Poppins. She was a fully formed woman, and that her great regret was that she never got really to express any of that stuff. And when she would try, they would all kind of go, "What, are you kidding?" So she never really she gave up trying. She took what she had and ran with it.
Yeah, she was really talented, and I mean, it's crazy when when you think about that show. And I mean, you would always hear these rumors, and I'm sure some of it was true, some of it wasn't, in my opinion, because you'd always hear Robert Reed was not a big fan of the show. But then I look, and anytime he was on the variety show, he was on the reunions they did, the Brady
Oh yeah.
Brides, everything. So how much did he really hate being on the show? Because he always came back, you know?
He came back because he loved the kids.
Yeah,
And when they started the show, he looked around and he realized that uh, a lot of these kids had the traditional stage mother, father, parents who were looking at the kids as a revenue stream.
yeah,
And they recognized that a talented kid could go far. And he didn't like that. He didn't think that he was not a father himself, but he did not. They would come to him with things because they bonded with him,
yeah.
and but they had good reason to because a lot of them were in situations with their parents that were not fabulous, and so once he was bonded with them, he stayed bonded with them to the end. I mean,
And
that
I,
that was his. I mean, no, did he like doing the show? No, I don't think he had any fun. I mean, he was a serious dramatic actor, and that hadn't happened. He'd had a big drama hit called The Defenders before, but it had not propelled him into anything bigger. And he was on Broadway doing comedies, but replacing people in comedies and stuff. But his career had not gone where he wanted him. And when this offer came along for the pilot, I'm sure both he and Florence thought, well, this won't probably go anyplace. I'll let them pay me for the pilot. And then, of course, trapped in a hit.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hit.
Somebody's going to write that memoir,
Yeah.
Trapped in a Hit.
It's been a hit forever, and I mean, he's still on TV every day. So I mean, his legacy
right.
lived on. But I always had respect for him as a person because, again, he didn't like being on the show, but he never took it out on the cast. And I thought that said a lot
Yeah.
about him because he was very good to those kids.
He was a rock. He really was, the whole thing.
Yeah. So Bruce, let me ask you, looking back on everything, I know like it's hard to dwell on things or, say this or that, but I mean, what are you most proud about that your career in these 50 plus
Wow.
years?
Yeah, I mean, being involved with Bette Midler from the beginning to the present day, Hairspray, the Oscar shows. I mean, those are the squares. Those are the highlights. I couldn't pick out one, but I mean,
Right.
those are the obvious things. I think what I'm proudest of is that uh, uh, I said yes to a lot of things, and as a result, I got involved in a lot of interesting stuff. I didn't limit myself, um, so I guess I am proud of that. And most of them worked out. But now I have a book about the ones that didn't. So there you go.
So
It
now,
worked out too.
when can we expect that book to come out?
I'm hoping for the spring, but it may get pushed back because of all the strikes.
Right.
Because they wanted to coincide with the Oscars, and
Do you have a title for it?
yes, it
Yeah.
seemed like a bad idea at the time.
That's a great title. I mean, really, it really is. I think that's going to be great to read. But I think the biggest thing that you should be proud of your career, Bruce, more than anything else, is that in 2023, you're still relevant. And if you're still relevant, that means you're doing good things out there.
Glad to hear it. I
Yeah.
wonder all the time, but thank you. That's great.
Right. So, Bruce, before we go, what would you say to the fans who have followed your career? What would you like to say to them?
Buy the book. This is a test. Buy the book.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other than that, thank you. And thank you for having me on this.
Yeah, definitely. And it was a real honor for me. And I really cannot wait for that book. Because you always, everything you write is wonderful. So I cannot wait to see that. But I do appreciate you giving me a few minutes today. It was a real honor for me. And I really applaud you, the work you've done in your career. And congratulations on what has been a very successful career.
Thank you.
Folks. Folks, that's the one and only Bruce Vilanch. I mean, he has done it all in his career. He's been a director, a writer, he's an actor. He can do everything. But the most important
Stripper,
thing,
you forgot that.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. But the most important thing,
Dance belt full of counterfeit 20s.
but the most important thing, folks, is he continues to work and he continues to do great things in his career. And I have to believe that the best is still yet to come. For In the Spotlight, I'm Mike Kenichi. That's Bruce Vilanch saying good night, everyone.